So thank you so much to English Australia for hosting this in the Mental Health SIG, and especially thanks to Trish and Sophie for supporting my work in this area. All right, so an outline of my presentation. I'll first talk a little bit about my background as it relates to this area, talk about some effects of post-traumatic stress disorder, how it affects language learning, what it has to do with us as teachers, talk you through some trauma-informed principles briefly, and then share with you my framework for trauma-informed teaching, which is informed by my PhD research. So a little bit about me. I'm very, very close to finishing my PhD. My thesis is an investigation into trauma-informed teaching of English as an additional language to adults in Southeast Queensland universities. My PhD is in the School of Social Work there, so I've been working with some amazing trauma experts over the last 6 years doing my PhD. I also work full-time at University of Southern Queensland, Uni SQ, where I teach English language and also in the tertiary prep programs. I've been teaching ESL and EFL since 2004, and I spent about 7 years as an English teacher overseas. So there I was also a language learner and linguistic minority, which has given me, of course, insights into the student experience. I myself was diagnosed with PTSD in 2013 as a result of living through the Fukushima disasters in Japan. I was living and working there, and I went into evacuation from the nuclear disaster and then went back and continued to teach for 8 months. And the community and I were, I guess, all traumatized, but we didn't quite realize it at the point. But this experience plus my recent cancer and surviving cancer has given me the lived experience of trauma, and it was a motivation for my PhD, and it certainly has helped me very much understand the topic very well that I've spent so many years researching now. So first, a little bit of information about post-traumatic stress. Students can often be wrongly assumed by teachers to be not interested in the class, and teachers might say, well, they're zoning out, they're asleep, they're not here, they're leaving the classroom up and down, they're distracting other students, or they're very distracted. And sometimes it turns out that the biggest class clown might be the most traumatized students. I have certainly found that in my experience. So we can never assume what is going on with our students, and we can also not assume why they might be behaving in a certain way. Post-traumatic stress can manifest in different ways with different cultural backgrounds, but the physiological changes that are caused by post-traumatic stress disorder are constant across different cultures. In some cultures, it might manifest though more in physical pain and aches. In some cultures, it's very rare, but in one particular ethnic group, fainting and seizures are a result of post-traumatic stress. And one of the most common for all people with post-traumatic stress is to go into that fight, flight, or freeze state. And of course, learning cannot happen when somebody is experiencing that. So we don't want our wonderful lessons to go to waste. So it's very well known through a lot of scientific research and literature that PTSD affects learning and language learning specifically. This doesn't mean that a person is incapable of learning, but when they're in that aroused state of being triggered, then it makes it very difficult. When a person goes through flashbacks, the amygdala, which is a part of the brain, is triggered, and that sets off that fight or flight impulse. In this situation, the pre-verbal brain takes over, and that can affect verbal learning, memory, concentration, long-term planning, the ability to organize information logically, and acquisition of an additional language. just to give you, I'll just go back to that. Just to give you an example of what that can be like. When I first returned to Australia and returned to teaching ESL, I was confronted in my teaching textbooks with chapters on natural disasters and other disasters. And because it was so unexpected, and I opened up the pages and saw graphic images and graphic language around that, I immediately my post-traumatic stress was triggered by that. And I actually blacked out. Other responses to that kind of material for me were just wanting to hide under the desk, to run outside, to vomit. Very, very visceral responses that it's not going to help just to say, well, you're in a safe situation. This is not happening now, because it's at that pre-verbal state. And again, no learning can take place when you're triggered like that. So when I had those experiences, I thought, what kind of things are going to make my students respond like that? And how can I prevent that? And that's what led to me in starting the research and led to my PhD. So you might say, well, what's this got to do with us? This is a serious problem that surely students have to go and seek professional help. But the thing is that if we medicalize it, that ignores the role of educational practices. The environment of trauma is so important, and we can make a difference. We can hinder or help our students depending on how we teach and what we teach. If we just ignore the problem and say, well, that's for the health and wellness section, that ignores that it leaves the students unsupported, and it leaves us as teachers unsupported as well. So it's really important to understand. Of course, we know that there are various barriers to mental health care, like stigma, the language, the cost, cultural beliefs, and also talking to a stranger about such things. And psychiatrists and trauma experts within psychiatry and psychology also agree that it's a multidisciplinary and a community approach is needed. It's not just the job of the mental health professionals, as our previous speaker was also talking about. Let's look at trauma in social terms. Trauma shatters trust, worldview, sense of safety, sense of meaning, connection, and identities and roles. So as a result of this, there are a few trauma-informed principles which we have to keep in mind, and which help to orient my study, my research. So some of these are safety and security, autonomy and voice, meaning, social bonds and belonging, justice, and working with the strengths of survivors and students. And this led to findings from my PhD, which my primary research was done, as I said, with students from 3 universities in Southeast Queensland, and they were screened for post-traumatic stress using a validated screening measure. And then I conducted in-depth interviews with them individually, which were based on trauma-informed principles about their experience of the language learning environment at their university. So for the purposes of today's presentation, I've put together an acronym, BrainTech, to explain the framework that has emerged out of my PhD. And I'll go through each of these over the next 10 minutes to explain what I mean. So the first one is building of English language autonomy. And the students of my study talked about a few ways that this happened. One was the way that teachers gave very encouraging and constructive feedback. When teachers blamed them for mistakes and said things like, oh, come on, you should know this easy grammar by now, why are you making this mistake? Or criticize them for forgetting something from the day before. This was not helpful at all to students. But if they were very patient, and coming from an encouraging perspective, this really made a difference to students. And I know our previous speaker talked about courage. Well, that was a word that was used a lot by my participants, and this quote is very much representative. They give us so much courage if we made progress. That's what a student was talking about, the teachers. And students said that when they got this kind of gentle encouragement, it made them so much more willing to communicate in English because they felt like they could do it. Another way to build English language autonomy was teaching English through familiar, relevant, and engaging topics. And most of us would be using course books that do this. But unfortunately, there are still courses, and I've taught in some and seen some where English is the course is treated like an instruction book for the English language, and it's very dry and it's very divorced from the wider world. So we want to absolutely avoid that. It's especially useful if students have content that allows them to relate it or compare it to their own cultures, and I'll talk more about that later. We also know from neuroscience that the human brain, if it's given too much information too quickly and that information is too different, then it goes into fight or flight. And that's not just for the traumatized brain, but that's the human brain in general. So it's so important to have that link with familiar material because they're already dealing with unfamiliar language. So if we're having unfamiliar concepts and unfamiliar and unfamiliar language, it's a step too far. Another way to provide autonomy is to give choices in essay and assignment topics, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Another finding was around recognizing and us understanding the identities of students, and they talked about two major identities. The first one was cultural, and you can include religious and ethnic in that. This is really important for a couple of reasons. Traumatized people feel threats to their core identity more acutely and are very sensitive to non-verbal cues. You probably noticed that your own students are very tuned in to kindness versus judgment. I've had a lot of cases where I felt I was doing just a tiny, tiny kindness, but students reacted with so much gratitude, and in some cases said it was one of the best days of their lives. And this makes me sad because I think, how were they treated by some other people? But it makes sense when you look at it from a trauma-informed perspective. Also, second language learners are far more vulnerable to the attitudes of the dominant group than we are to them. The second major identity they talked about was English language learner itself. So not treating them as a deficient native speaker, scaffolding our English, slowing down, using accessible language, and again, not blaming them for mistakes. The next one is attunement by teachers. And participants talked about, or they compared teachers who just want to finish their work and go out, and those who were able to connect personally. And there was a real gap in how the teachers understood their students. The teachers who paid close attentiveness and had a real presence and engagement to students felt that these teachers understood them really well. They were observant not only to their words, but they could interpret their English. They were very observant to their nonverbals. And these teachers were able to respond to and anticipate students' needs on an academic, personal, and cultural level. And this in turn led to safety, belonging, acceptance, and connection. And we know from the neuroscience that this puts the brain in a safe state and it's able to learn. Okay, the next one is institutional supports. These are beyond the control of teachers, but still so important. Some of the students went to a university which provided a lot of targeted extracurricular activities for ESL students. Some of these were about English and some of these were cooking, music, art. These provided a sense of belonging, connection, and safety. And of course, they also gave them the opportunity to practice English, and that really, really helped students. Safe and secure campus was important, approachable managers, and preemptive help with practical matters like technical issues made a big difference. A need for voice. Voice is so important in trauma, but also in teaching. And this refers to literal voice in terms of student talk time and also metaphorical voice. So having a choice in certain matters, as I said, topic choices in the essay or in a presentation topic. Decision making was important to students in large matters, for example, being able to change their teachers or classes, being able to choose or change their group for an assessment. But they also didn't want to be overwhelmed with choices, and trauma and choice, trauma and control and choice, it's a nuanced relationship. So curating choices, not giving them too many to be overwhelmed. And there's also a cultural element of what's the duty of students and what's the duty of teachers. The next one is transformative learning. This was a major theme, and the students told me how this happened in two ways that are interconnected. This was a meaningful syllabus and interactive learning with their peers, as long as their peers were motivated and they were friendly. A meaningful syllabus, especially one that was connected with the students' cultures, gave them a lot of motivation to communicate with their peers. And this in turn led to interactive and collaborative learning that gave students a sense of safety, belonging, reduced stress, and synergistic knowledge. And this led to English language learning, and also, they said, a broadening of their minds and even a changed understanding of reality. So even though the students in my study were in really high stakes courses, and they needed to pass to get into their chosen degrees, or they were doing it for work purposes and they really had to do well. They didn't want to just get an IELTS score or didn't want to just pass the test and go on. They really, were invested in a more holistic view of learning, which I thought was really, really interesting. Okay, the next one is egalitarian relationships. And there are two aspects to this: teacher to student and student to student. Now, I'm sure nobody in this group who would be in mental health SIG would engage in this kind of teaching, but unfortunately, there is still infantilizing authoritarian teaching out there in the ESL and EFL space. And students, unfortunately, did tell me about teachers who yelled at them, who punished them, who shamed them in front of the group, which was especially damaging. And these were not for major things like cheating. This was for things like talking in class, speaking their first language, or coming in late. And students told me that when teachers instead focused on solutions or came from a place of compassion, that was so much more effective. So there we have the word again, blaming again, which came up quite a lot. A quick example, one student told me that when she was late for class, if this teacher said, "Oh, you're late," she felt like, well, you don't need to publicly shame me. I know I'm late. But if the teacher said, "Oh, you're late, are you okay? Are you sick?" It really had a profoundly different effect on her. And it also should be noted that trauma and shame are very closely linked. People who've been traumatized even more traumatized by being shamed. The students also told me that equality between peers was important. Having the same level of English made them feel safe. Feeling socially equal made them feel safe. And teachers were able to foster this equality by valuing all students and their cultures, not singling them out, and taking something positive from all student contributions. All right, we're nearly at the end. Just a couple more things. It should go without saying, but I know a lot of textbooks have stuff like this. Please don't use teaching materials about war, disasters, terrorism, because that can be really terrifying for students, especially if they don't know that it's coming up. Provide regular breaks for stretching and air. 40 or 50 minutes apparently is the best time. I always tell my students, look, if you want to get up and stretch in the middle of the class, please go for it, and they'll find me stretching in the class as well. Trauma, as I said, leads to a lot of aches and pains and somatizing of symptoms. Let people know, let your students know they're up front that they're free to leave, take a break when they're needed, get some air. It can get very, very overwhelming, and often students don't know that they are allowed to do that, or or they think they can't do that, and it can be even scary to ask. When people have survived trauma, they can feel trapped and panicky in a room, and body pain can make it sitting for a long period really actually quite unbearable. All right, nearly at the end. If you would like more information, I have a website, humaninformedtesol.com. I also have a LinkedIn special interest group that you can find. You can friend me on LinkedIn. There's also an interview by Trish, so please look for that on the English Australia YouTube channel, and you're welcome to email me v.wilson@uq.net.au. And that's 20 minutes and 12 seconds. Woohoo! Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Trish. I'll just stop sharing my screen.